My brother-in-law blew his savings on crypto. Now my in-laws want me to co-sign his mortgage. But I had one reply I won't forget. I'm 34 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood exactly where I stood in my wife's family. Turns out I was completely wrong about how far they'd go to protect their golden boy, even when he'd proven himself to be a complete financial disaster. My brother-in-law Kevin has always been the family favorite, the one who could do no wrong in his parents' eyes, while I was just the reliable guy who married their daughter. Let me give you some background on how this whole mess started. Kevin is 29, and he's been living with my in-laws Harold and Judith for the past 2 years, ostensibly saving money for a house down payment, but really just coasting through life without any real responsibilities. My wife Catherine and I have been married for 6 years, and we've built what I thought was a solid relationship with her parents. We visit for holidays, help with yard work, and generally try to be good family members. The contrast between how they treat Kevin versus how they treat me has always been obvious, but I've tried not to let it bother me. Kevin gets praised for basic adult tasks like doing his own laundry or showing up to family dinners on time. Meanwhile, I can renovate their entire bathroom for free and barely get a thank you. Harold owns a small accounting firm, and Judith worked as a school administrator before retiring. They're comfortable financially but not wealthy by any means. Kevin works in IT for a mid-sized company making decent money, but he's always been obsessed with get-rich-quick schemes. Over the years, it's been day trading, penny stocks, multi-level marketing programs, and various online business ventures that never amount to anything. Harold and Judith always support these endeavors, talking about Kevin's entrepreneurial spirit and his innovative thinking. About 18 months ago, Kevin discovered cryptocurrency, and that's when things really went off the rails. He started talking about Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these altcoins at every family gathering, explaining to anyone who'd listen how traditional investments were for suckers and how crypto was the future of wealth creation. Harold would nod along like Kevin was dispensing wisdom, while I just sit there thinking about how volatile and unpredictable the whole crypto market was. I work as an HVAC technician, and I've always been conservative with money. Catherine and I bought a modest 3-bedroom house 5 years ago. We pay our bills on time, have an emergency fund, and contribute to our retirement accounts. Nothing fancy, but we're financially stable. Kevin used to make jokes about how boring our approach to money was, how we were missing out on real opportunities to build wealth. The warning signs were obvious to anyone paying attention. Kevin started checking his phone constantly during family dinners, monitoring crypto prices and talking about massive gains he was supposedly making. He'd show us screenshots of his portfolio, claiming he'd doubled or tripled his investments, but he never seemed to actually cash anything out. It was always about holding for even bigger gains. Catherine started getting worried about 6 months ago. She tried to talk to Kevin about diversifying his investments or at least taking some profits, but he'd brush her off, saying she didn't understand the technology or the market dynamics. Harold and Judith would back him up, talking about how young people needed to take risks to build wealth. Then about 4 months ago, Kevin started acting differently. He wasn't bragging about his crypto gains anymore, and he seemed stressed all the time. When Catherine asked him about it, he'd change the subject or make vague comments about market volatility being temporary. Harold and Judith didn't seem to notice, or maybe they were choosing not to notice. The truth came out 3 weeks ago during what was supposed to be a normal Sunday dinner. Catherine and I arrived at her parents' house to find everyone sitting around the dining room table with serious expressions. Harold looked like he'd aged 5 years since the last time I'd seen him. Kevin had lost everything, not just his crypto investments, but money he borrowed against his 401k, credit card, cash advances, and even some funds he convinced Harold and Judith to lend him for what he claimed were sure-thing investments. The total damage was somewhere around $80,000. When Harold explained the situation, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Kevin hadn't just gambled away his own money, he'd taken advantage of his parents' trust and loved to fund his cryptocurrency addiction. Harold and Judith had given him $15,000 from their retirement savings because Kevin had convinced them it was a guaranteed return. But here's what really got to me. Instead of holding Kevin accountable for his terrible decisions, Harold and Judith were already talking about how to fix the situation. They'd been to a bank and learned that Kevin's credit was too damaged for him to qualify for a mortgage on his own, which meant he couldn't move forward with buying a house. That's when Harold looked at me and said they'd been hoping I might be willing to help Kevin get back on his feet by co-signing a mortgage for him. They'd already found a house. Kevin wanted a nice 4-bedroom colonial in a good neighborhood, and the monthly payment would only be about $1,800. Only $1,800, like that was pocket change. Harold explained that Kevin had learned his lesson and was completely done with risky investments. He just needed someone with good credit to help him qualify for the loan. Catherine was looking at me expectantly, and I could tell she thought this was a reasonable request. I sat there trying to process what they were asking me to do. They wanted me to put my financial future at risk to bail out someone who'd just proven he had absolutely no judgment when it came to money. Kevin hadn't even apologized for losing his parents. Retirement savings, he was sitting there looking sullen like he was the victim in all this. That's when I realized this family's dysfunction ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. They weren't asking Kevin to face consequences for his actions. They were asking me to enable him to continue living beyond his means, and they expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to help. After Harold made his request, the room went quiet. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my response. I could see Catherine's hopeful expression and Harold and Judith's expectant faces. Kevin was staring at his hands like he was embarrassed, but not nearly embarrassed enough for someone who'd just blown $80,000. I told them I needed time to think about it, which was my polite way of saying absolutely not, but I didn't want to cause a scene right there at the dinner table. Harold nodded and said of course they understood it was a big decision, but they hoped I'd consider how much it would mean to Kevin to get a fresh start. On the drive home, Catherine was unusually quiet. Finally, she said she thought it would be nice if we could help her brother get back on his feet. She pointed out that the house was in a good neighborhood and would probably appreciate in value over time. Like that somehow made the risk acceptable. I explained to Catherine that co-signing a loan meant being legally responsible for the debt if Kevin couldn't make payments. Given his recent track record with money, I didn't feel comfortable taking that risk. Catherine got defensive, saying Kevin had learned his lesson and wouldn't make the same mistakes again. How exactly had he learned his lesson? I asked. He'd lost his parents' money along with his own, and instead of facing consequences, he was being rescued by family members who were enabling his irresponsible behavior. Catherine said I was being too harsh. That family was supposed to help each other during difficult times. Over the next week, Harold called me twice to discuss the co-signing arrangement. He'd done research on the property in the neighborhood. He'd even spoken to Kevin's employer to confirm his job security. Everything was lined up. They just needed my signature on the loan documents. I told Harold I was still thinking about it, but privately I'd already made up my mind. There was no way I was co-signing a mortgage for someone who just demonstrated such spectacular poor judgment with money. Harold seemed confident he could convince me, though. He kept emphasizing how this was Kevin's chance to rebuild his life. Then Judith got involved. She called Catherine to express her disappointment that I was taking so long to make a decision. She said she'd always thought of me as family and she'd hoped I'd be more willing to help when Kevin really needed it. Catherine relayed this conversation to me, and I could tell she was starting to feel caught in the middle. The pressure really ramped up when Harold suggested we all meet for lunch to discuss the details of the co-signing arrangement. He'd brought loan documents and had calculated exactly what my monthly obligation would be if Kevin defaulted. He presented it like it was just a formality, like my agreement was inevitable. Kevin was there too, and he finally spoke up about the situation. He thanked me for considering helping him and said he knew he'd made mistakes, but he was committed to being more responsible going forward. He talked about how much the house meant to him, how it represented a new chapter in his life. I listened to Kevin's speech, and I couldn't help but notice he never actually apologized for losing his parents' money or acknowledged the full scope of his poor decisions. He talked about making mistakes like he'd just forgotten to pay a credit card bill on time, not gambled away someone else's retirement savings. Harold jumped in to support Kevin's points. He emphasized that Kevin was young and everyone makes mistakes when they're learning about investing. He said the important thing was that Kevin had learned from this experience and was ready to make better choices. That's when I asked Harold what consequences Kevin was facing for losing their $15,000. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He said they weren't worried about the money, that helping family was more important than keeping score. But I pressed the issue, was Kevin paying them back? Was he contributing more to household expenses? Was he facing any kind of accountability for his actions? Harold got uncomfortable and said they were handling that privately as a family. It became clear that Kevin wasn't facing any real consequences at all. He was still living rent-free with his parents, still working the same job, still essentially being treated like the golden boy who'd just had a run of bad luck rather than someone who'd made catastrophically poor decisions. Judith tried a different approach. She talked about how Kevin had always looked up to me, how much my approval meant to him. She said co-signing the mortgage would show Kevin that I believed in him and his ability to turn things around. The emotional manipulation was getting thick, but what really bothered me was how they were framing this as somehow being about my relationship with Kevin rather than about basic financial responsibility. They were acting like my reluctance to risk my credit and financial security was a personal rejection of Kevin. Catherine was getting more frustrated with me too. She said her parents thought I was being unreasonable, that family members should support each other during tough times. She couldn't understand why I was being so stubborn about helping her brother. That weekend, Harold called with what he presented as great news. He'd spoken to the bank, and they were willing to structure the loan so that Kevin would be the primary borrower and I'd just be the co-signer for qualification purposes. He made it sound like this reduced my risk somehow. I explained to Harold that being a co-signer meant being fully responsible for the debt regardless of how the paperwork was structured. If Kevin missed payments, it would affect my credit. If he defaulted, I'd be legally obligated to pay the full amount. Harold seemed surprised that I understood the actual implications of co-signing. Then Kevin called me directly, which was unusual. We'd never been close and rarely spoke one-on-one. He said he understood my concerns, but wanted to assure me personally that he would never let me down. He learned his lesson about risky investments and was focused on building a stable future. I asked Kevin what his plan was for rebuilding his savings, how he intended to avoid future financial disasters. He gave me vague answers about being more careful and diversifying his investments, but he couldn't provide any specific details about budgeting or financial planning. That conversation confirmed what I already knew. Kevin hadn't learned anything meaningful from his crypto disaster. He was just looking for someone else to enable his continued irresponsibility, and his family was pressuring me to be that enabler. But they had no idea what my response was going to be. Instead of giving Harold and Judith an immediate answer, I decided to do some research of my own. If they wanted me to co-sign a mortgage for Kevin, I was going to learn everything I could about his actual financial situation, not just the sanitized version his parents were presenting. I started with public records. The house Kevin wanted to buy was indeed in a nice neighborhood, but it was also priced about $30,000 above similar properties in the area. Harold had presented this as a great investment opportunity, but the numbers suggested Kevin was overpaying for the property. Then I did something that felt a little sneaky but necessary. I asked Catherine to find out more details about Kevin's crypto losses. She was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to talk to him about exactly what had happened. She came back with information that made the situation even worse than I'd thought. Kevin hadn't just lost money on legitimate cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. He'd also invested heavily in something called Dogecoin and several other meme coins that had no real utility or long-term prospects. He'd also fallen for at least two pump and dump schemes where he bought into coins just before their values crashed. But the most disturbing detail was how Kevin had funded these investments. He'd maxed out 3 credit cards, taken a loan against his 401k, and convinced Harold and Judith to give him money by claiming he had inside information about upcoming crypto developments. In other words, he'd systematically lied to finance his gambling addiction. Catherine also revealed that Kevin's job situation wasn't as stable as Harold had presented. His employer had recently implemented layoffs and Kevin's department was being restructured. He wasn't in immediate danger of losing his job, but his position was far from secure. I decided to look into Kevin's employment history and discovered he'd been fired from his previous job for inappropriate use of company computers. Apparently, he'd been trading crypto during work hours and using company internet to research investments. This was information Harold and Judith either didn't know or had chosen not to share with me. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Kevin's crypto losses weren't just bad luck or poor timing. They were the result of compulsive gambling behavior and consistently poor decision-making. He'd ignored every warning sign, chased every get-rich-quick scheme, and lied to his family to fund his addiction. But what really opened my eyes was a conversation I had with my neighbor Jake, who works in banking. I asked him hypothetically about co-signing mortgages and what risks were involved. Jake explained that co-signers are often left holding the bag when primary borrowers default, especially when those borrowers have already demonstrated financial irresponsibility. Jake told me that in his experience, people who lose large amounts of money to gambling or risky investments rarely change their behavior without serious intervention and consequences, enabling them by providing access to more credit usually just delays the inevitable crash. That's when I realized what Harold and Judith were really asking me to do. They wanted me to help Kevin avoid facing the natural consequences of his poor decisions. They were so focused on protecting him from discomfort that they were willing to put my financial security at risk. I also discovered that Harold's accounting firm had been struggling recently. Several clients had left, and he'd had to reduce his staff by 2 people. The $15,000 they'd given Kevin represented a significant portion of their liquid savings, and losing it had put them in a precarious position financially. This explained why they were so eager to get Kevin out of their house and why they were pressuring me to co-sign his mortgage. They couldn't afford to support him indefinitely, but they also couldn't bear to watch him face real consequences for his actions. The final piece of information came from Catherine herself, who admitted that Kevin had asked her and me for money several times over the past year, small amounts that he'd claimed were for car repairs or emergency expenses, but which we now knew had probably gone toward funding his crypto investments. When I asked Catherine why she hadn't told me about these requests, she said Kevin had asked her not to mention them to me because he was embarrassed about needing help. She'd given him about $1,200 total money that had come out of our joint account without my knowledge. I felt betrayed not just by Kevin's deception, but by Catherine's willingness to hide his financial problems from me. She'd been enabling his irresponsible behavior just like her parents, and now they all expected me to take it to the next level by co-signing a mortgage. That weekend, I sat down with Catherine and laid out everything I'd discovered about Kevin's situation: the overpriced house, his unstable employment history, the full extent of his crypto losses, and the pattern of deception he'd used to fund his gambling Catherine was shocked by some of the details, particularly about Kevin being fired from his previous job for trading during work hours. She'd known he was interested in crypto, but she hadn't realized the extent of his obsession or the lies he'd told to finance it. I explained to Catherine that co-signing Kevin's mortgage wouldn't help him. It would just enable him to continue avoiding responsibility for his actions. What Kevin needed was to face real consequences for his poor decisions, not another bailout from family members. Catherine started to understand my position, but she was worried about how her parents would react if I refused to co-sign the loan. She said they'd invested so much emotional energy in Kevin's house purchase that my refusal would devastate them. That's when I realized the whole family had been sucked into Kevin's fantasy. They were all so invested in the idea of him being successful that they couldn't see how their enabling behavior was actually making things worse. I told Catherine I'd made my decision about the co-signing request and that I'd be sharing it with her parents soon, but first I wanted to give her a chance to prepare for their reaction because it wasn't going to be what they expected. I'd spent weeks being patient and diplomatic, trying to find a way to refuse their request without causing family drama, but my research had convinced me that being diplomatic wasn't going to work. Harold and Judith were too invested in protecting Kevin to accept a simple no. They needed to understand not just that I wasn't going to co-sign the mortgage, but why their approach to Kevin's problems was fundamentally flawed, and they needed to hear it in terms they couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. What I was about to tell them would change the entire dynamic of our relationship, but sometimes the truth is more important than keeping the peace. The showdown happened the following Sunday at Harold and Judith's house. They'd arranged another family dinner specifically to finalize the co-signing arrangement. They'd even prepared the loan documents and had them spread out on the dining room table when Catherine and I arrived. Kevin was there looking more optimistic than I'd seen him since the crypto crash. Harold had obviously told him that my agreement was just a formality, that we were just working out the final details. Judith had made Kevin's favorite meal and the whole atmosphere felt celebratory. After dinner, Harold cleared his throat and said he appreciated my willingness to help Kevin get back on his feet. He started going through the loan documents, explaining the terms and pointing out where my signature would be needed. Kevin was nodding along eagerly and Catherine was looking nervous. I let Harold finish his presentation, then I stood up and said I had something important to tell everyone. The room went quiet and all eyes turned to me. I could see the expectation in their faces. They were all assuming I was about to agree to co-sign the mortgage. Harold, I said, looking directly at him, I've given this a lot of thought and I've done extensive research on Kevin's financial situation and the house he wants to buy, and my answer is absolutely not. The silence that followed was deafening. Harold's face went from confident to confused to angry in about 3 seconds. Judith looked like I just slapped her. Kevin's mouth actually fell open. But I wasn't finished. I continued explaining that Kevin hadn't just made mistakes with cryptocurrency, he'd engaged in systematic financial fraud. He'd lied to his family about having inside information, he'd stolen time from his employer to trade during work hours, and he'd manipulated everyone around him to fund his gambling addiction. Harold tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. Furthermore, I said the house Kevin wants to buy is overpriced by $30,000. His job security is questionable at best, and his track record with money makes him the worst possible candidate for a mortgage cosigner. Judith found her voice first. She said I was being cruel and vindictive, that Kevin had learned from his mistakes and deserved a second chance. I asked her what specific lessons Kevin had learned and what consequences he'd faced for losing their retirement money. When she couldn't answer, I turned to Kevin directly. Kevin, I said, you lost $80,000, including $15,000 that belonged to your parents. You lied repeatedly to fund your crypto gambling, and you were fired from your previous job for trading during work hours. What exactly have you learned from this experience? Kevin stammered something about being more careful in the future, but he couldn't articulate any specific changes he'd made to his approach to money or investing. He was still the same person who'd made catastrophically poor decisions, just looking for someone else to enable his continued irresponsibility. I pulled out a folder with all the research I compiled and spread it across the table. Harold, I said, since you're an accountant, I thought you might appreciate seeing the actual numbers. I showed them documentation of Kevin's employment history, including the termination from his previous job, the details of his crypto investments, including the meme coins and pump and dump schemes, and the current market analysis showing the house was overpriced. But the document that really got their attention was a timeline I'd created showing every lie Kevin had told over the past 18 months and every time family members had given him money based on those lies. Harold studied the papers with growing horror. He hadn't known about Kevin being fired or about the specific types of crypto investments Kevin had made. Judith was reading over his shoulder, and I could see her face getting paler with each revelation. You want to know what Kevin has learned from this experience? I continued. He's learned that his family will always bail him out no matter how irresponsible his behavior becomes. He's learned that he can lie and manipulate and still be treated like the golden boy who just needs another chance. Catherine was staring at her brother like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Kevin was looking down at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I wasn't done, though. Harold, you gave Kevin $15,000 from your retirement savings based on his lies about having inside information about crypto investments. That money is gone forever because Kevin gambled it away on joke currencies and scam schemes. Now you want me to risk my credit and financial security to help him buy an overpriced house while he faces zero consequences for his actions. You want me to enable the same behavior that already cost you $15,000. The room was completely silent. Harold was still staring at the documents, trying to process everything. Judith looked like she might cry. Kevin was sitting perfectly still, like he was hoping everyone would forget he was there. But here's what really bothers me about this situation, I continued. You've spent months pressuring me to co-sign this mortgage, but you never once asked Kevin to pay you back the money he lost. You never required him to get financial counseling. You never made him contribute more to household expenses. Nothing. Instead, you decided that the solution to Kevin's irresponsible behavior was to give him access to even more money through a mortgage he can't qualify for on his own. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each of them. So here's my response to your request. I will not co-sign Kevin's mortgage. I will not enable his continued financial irresponsibility, and I will not pretend that what he did was just a mistake that everyone should overlook. If Kevin wants to buy a house, he can rebuild his credit, save for a down payment, and qualify for a mortgage on his own like every other responsible adult. If you want to help him, you can require him to pay back the $15,000 he lost, get professional financial counseling, and prove that he's actually changed his behavior. Harold finally looked up from the documents. His face was red, and he was clearly angry, but when he started to speak, I could tell he knew I was right. You've made your point, he said stiffly, but you're being unnecessarily harsh. Kevin is family. Family, I repeated, then treat him like family. Hold him accountable for his actions. Help him become a better person instead of enabling his worst impulses. I stood up and gathered my papers. Catherine and I are leaving now. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about Kevin's problems and real solutions that don't involve me risking my financial security, let me know. As we walked to the car, Catherine was quiet. I could tell she was processing everything she'd learned about her brother and her family's dysfunction. 3 weeks later, Kevin moved out of Harold and Judith's house, not into his dream home, but into a small apartment he could actually afford. Harold called to apologize for pressuring me and admitted they'd been enabling Kevin's behavior. Kevin himself has been radio silent, but Harold mentioned he started seeing a financial counselor and has been making small payments toward the money he owes his parents. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst behavior, even when their family expects you to play along.